Ready for a deep dive. Today, we're going deep into the life of Dasani Coates,
Oh, yeah.
this young girl in New York City.
Yeah.
And we're using excerpts from Invisible Child for this one.
Great source material.
And I have to say, this book hit hard.
Yeah, it really stayed with me.
So we meet Dasani, and right away she's this all fire wants to be first. First in line, firstborn, just
Oh, wow.
first in everything.
I see that.
Like, she needs to have control when everything else is just
Yeah.
out of reach.
Makes you think about what that means, you know,
Totally.
that need to be first. It's almost like a deep down desire to be recognized, don't you think?
Totally.
To matter.
Yes, exactly. And then there's her name, Dasani.
Oh, right.
Like, her mom wanted something more for her.
Always striving. Yeah.
Always. And that bottled water, Dasani, like
Yeah.
a luxury they just can't afford.
Totally out of reach.
Right,
A little ironic.
for sure.
And then the Auburn Place shelter where she lives.
Oh, yeah. The book describes it like this fortress.
And it's less of a haven, more like a...
I know, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's intense. Imagine like metal detectors and bag searches and just constantly being watched
Every single day.
every day. And that's Dasani's life.
It's a lot.
It is. And it makes you think about, you know, how do kids growing up in poverty,
Yeah, how do they even...
how do they hold on to that sense of hope, you know?
I know, because if you're always worried about where your next meal is coming from, or...
Right. Or if you even have a place to sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah, the book really makes you feel that weight, that constant struggle.
It's got to do something to you.
It does. It really gets under your skin, you know? And you start to see how that scarcity, that constant state of not having enough, how it becomes its own kind of trauma.
Right.
And for a child like Dasani, it shapes everything. Her worldview, how she sees herself, her relationships, even her dreams.
It's like her reality is just so different.
Exactly.
It's just heartbreaking to think about, you know,
It really gets to you.
a child going through that.
Yeah. And it makes you think about Dasani's parents, Chanel and Supreme.
Right, their love story.
It's like beautiful and tragic at the same time.
Totally. They found each other while they were homeless and dealing with addiction. It's like, how do you even...
I know, it makes you question what resilience really means.
For real. And the book doesn't shy away from their past. Their struggles with addiction, run-ins with the law, always afraid of losing their kids.
Right, and it all ties back to that cycle of poverty.
Exactly. And the book does a great job of connecting those dots, you know?
Yeah.
From Dasani's story to these bigger historical forces, segregation, redlining.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
The crack epidemic. It's like generations of families impacted by these things.
Absolutely. And it's still happening today. Take redlining, for example.
It's crazy how that still affects things.
It is. It was this whole system where banks would literally like draw red lines on maps.
No way!
Yeah, and those red lines, they marked off neighborhoods, mostly black and brown neighborhoods, where they wouldn't give loans or services.
So messed up.
It was. And that denial of opportunity, it created this legacy of poverty that we're still seeing today. Families like Dasani's are still dealing with the effects.
It's like they never even had a chance.
Right. And then you add in the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it just devastated communities of color.
Exactly. And we can't talk about that without acknowledging the role of policies that criminalized black and brown communities. The war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, all of that created this perfect storm that ripped apart families and left behind this trauma that echoes through generations.
It's heavy stuff. And it makes you realize that Dasani's story isn't just hers, it's part of this bigger story of systemic inequities.
It is. And within that bigger story, we see her extended family, her grandmother Joannie, her aunts and uncles, they're all carrying the weight of these historical burdens.
And yet there's this incredible love in their family.
Right. They might not have much, but they have each other. That comes through so strongly in the book.
It does. But then there's this other side of the system that's supposed to be helping foster care. And it ends up being another source of trauma when Dasani and her siblings are separated.
Yeah, it's a tough one. The intention is good, right?
Yeah.
To keep kids safe.
Of course.
But the reality is way more complicated. Being ripped away from your family, your support system,
Yeah.
and then being thrown into this new environment.
It's a lot for a kid to handle.
It is. Especially for someone like Dasani, who's already dealing with so much poverty, systemic racism, and this pressure to break free from the cycle she was born into.
It makes you wonder if the system is even set up to help kids like her succeed.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
And then Dasani gets his chance to go to Hershey, this boarding school. It's like a whole other world compared to what she's used to.
Talk about a culture shock, right?
Okay.
From that shelter to a place with its own chocolate factory. It's a huge shift.
It really is. But of course, it's not all sunshine and roses for her. She's leaving her family behind, dealing with the pressure to succeed in this new environment. And always that thought in the back of her mind that it could all disappear.
That's a heavy weight to carry around. And it makes you think about what success even means in this context. Is it escaping poverty? Getting a good education? Dasani's story really makes you grapple with those questions.
It does, because she has these opportunities she never would have had otherwise, right? But then there's this guilt, this knowledge that her family had to make sacrifices for her to be there.
It's like she's caught between two worlds and never fully belongs to either one.
Exactly. And even though she tries to fit in at Hershey to excel in her classes, there's this pullback to her family and her community.
That's something a lot of kids from marginalized communities face, I think. That tension between wanting a better future for yourself and feeling obligated to the people you left behind.
It's a lot for anyone to deal with, let alone a kid. And I think that's what makes Dasani's story so powerful. It forces us to look beyond these simplistic ideas about poverty and resilience.
It reminds us that there's no easy fix, no one solution that's going to magically erase these systemic issues. It's about acknowledging those barriers while also celebrating the strength and determination of people like Dasani who are fighting against them.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Dasani's world, it makes you wonder what we can learn from her story. How can we as individuals and as a society actually make a difference? How do we create a world where every child has a chance to thrive? Something to think about.
Definitely gives us all a lot to reflect on. It's been a great conversation.
It has. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
Any